Sometimes the truth slips out in the middle of a toast when everyone is smiling and pretending everything is fine. I had spent years telling myself the little exclusions were just in my head, that my mother was only trying to keep the peace. But that weekend at the beach cottage in Delaware showed me how deep those invisible rules really went and how much they had shaped every family gathering I had ever attended. If you have ever felt like you were quietly being kept on the outside of your own family while everyone else moved on without you, I hope this story gives you something to hold on to. Drop support if you needed this. I was 31 years old and living in a small apartment a few towns over from the shore when my mother called. It was a Thursday evening in early summer, and I had just gotten home from work at the local accounting firm where I had been for the past 4 years. The phone rang while I was still in my work clothes, standing in the kitchen with a glass of water in my hand. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Emily, it's your mother, she said, her voice bright in that careful way she used when she had already decided how things were going to go. The family is heading to the beach cottage this weekend for your Aunt Linda's retirement celebration. It would mean a lot if you could be there. We are planning a big dinner on the screened porch Friday night, and everyone is coming. I felt the familiar small twist in my stomach, the one that always appeared when she invited me to something after the plans had already been made. That sounds nice, I said, keeping my voice even. What time should I get there? There was a short pause on her end. Then she said, Susan Whitaker called me yesterday. She was just concerned that these big weekends can sometimes feel overwhelming. She thought it might be easier for you if you came Saturday morning instead of staying the whole time. That way you would not have to deal with all the setup and the late nights. Susan Whitaker had been my mother's closest friend for as long as I could remember. She was the kind of woman who always spoke in soft, worried tones, the kind who said, I am only thinking of you, right before she suggested something that made my life smaller. This was not the first time she had helped by offering an opinion that left me standing on the edge of whatever was happening. I took a slow breath before I answered. I appreciate Susan looking out for me, but I would like to come for the full weekend. I can help with whatever needs doing. My mother let out a small laugh that did not quite reach warmth. Well, if you are sure. Just remember that Susan only wants what is best for everyone. She hates seeing anyone uncomfortable. After we hung up, I stood in the quiet kitchen for a long time. The invisible rules had always been there even when I was a child. My mother would plan family trips and forget to tell me the dates until the last minute. She would have long phone calls with Susan about how to handle holidays so that no one got upset. She would smile and say I was too sensitive when I noticed that my name was missing from group texts or that decisions about the cottage had already been made without asking me. I had learned to stay quiet about it because arguing only made her pull back further, and the distance between us would grow thicker for weeks afterward. I decided I was going anyway. I packed a small bag Friday morning before work left early and drove the 2 hours to the cottage. The air smelled like salt and warm sand when I pulled into the gravel driveway. The screened porch stretched across the front of the weathered cedar shingled house, the same porch where I had spent so many summers as a kid watching storms roll in over the water. I could hear voices inside, already laughter, the clink of glasses being set out. My Aunt Linda Thompson was the first one to come out onto the porch when she heard my car. She was in her early 60s with short silver hair and the kind of easy smile that made you feel seen. Emily, you made it, she said, pulling me into a hug that felt genuine. I am so glad you are here for the whole weekend. Your mother mentioned you might only come for the day, but I told her that was nonsense. Before I could answer, my mother stepped out behind her. Helen Carter was 62, still trim, and carefully put together even in casual clothes. She gave me a quick hug and then stepped back. You are early, she said. Susan and I were just talking about how nice it would be to have a quiet dinner tomorrow instead of making tonight too crowded. But since you are here, we will figure it out. Susan Whitaker appeared in the doorway a moment later. She was a small woman with carefully styled hair and the perpetual expression of someone who was worried about everyone else's feelings. Emily, dear, she said, coming forward to squeeze my arm. I hope the drive was not too much. I told your mother these weekends can be a lot when people have been apart for a while. I am just glad you're taking care of yourself. The words landed exactly the way they always did, soft on the surface and sharp underneath. She was not glad I was there. She was reminding everyone that my presence required extra managing. I smiled and said I was fine. I carried my bag inside and put it in the small bedroom at the back of the cottage that had always been mine on these visits. The room was exactly as I remembered it, the same faded quilt on the bed, the same view of the dunes through the window. I stood there for a minute, listening to the voices on the porch. My cousin Rachel Thompson was out there now, too, her laugh carrying through the screen. Rachel was 2 years older than me and had always been the one person in the extended family who treated me like I belonged without any extra effort. I walked back out onto the porch and joined them. The late afternoon light was soft on the water. My uncle Frank Thompson was lighting the small fire pit at the edge of the porch while my Aunt Linda poured drinks. Susan was sitting in the wicker chair closest to my mother, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. When I sat down on the empty chair at the far end of the porch, Susan looked up and gave me that same concerned smile. "We were just saying how peaceful it is out here," she said. "Sometimes it is nice to keep things simple, especially when people are tired from the week." My mother nodded. "Exactly. Susan always knows how to read the room." I felt the old familiar sting, the one that came from being discussed like a problem that needed solving rather than a person who was simply part of the family. I did not argue. I had learned a long time ago that arguing only gave them more reasons to say I was difficult. Instead, I asked my Aunt Linda about her retirement plans, and for a little while the conversation stayed light. Later that evening, while everyone was still on the porch watching the sun go down, my cousin Rachel came and sat beside me on the steps. She kept her voice low. "I heard my mom and Susan talking earlier," she said. "They were deciding which nights you should be here and which nights it would be easier if you stayed home. I told them that was ridiculous, but they acted like I was the one being difficult." I looked at her surprised. Rachel had never been the type to insert herself into these things before. "Thanks for saying something," I told her. She shrugged. "It is not right the way they do it. Like there is some rule that you are supposed to stay small so everyone else can relax." That was the closest anyone had ever come to naming the invisible rules out loud. I did not know what to say, so I just nodded and we sat there watching the waves until it got dark. After everyone had gone to bed, I stayed up for a while walking through the quiet cottage. In the small storage room off the kitchen, I found an old cardboard box pushed behind some beach chairs. It had my grandmother's handwriting on the side. I opened it without really thinking, just curious. Inside were old photo albums and a stack of letters tied with twine. One envelope had my name on it in my grandmother's careful script. It was dated almost 15 years earlier. I took the letter out onto the porch where the moonlight was bright enough to read by. The paper was thin and the ink had faded in places, but the words were still clear. My grandmother had written to my mother about the family gatherings and about me. She had said that keeping me at a distance was not protecting anyone, that it was only teaching me I did not belong. She had asked my mother to stop listening to people who told her that excluding me would make things easier. The letter ended with a line I had to read twice. "Helen, the rules you are following are not love. They are fear dressed up as care." I sat on the porch steps with the letter in my hands for a long time after I finished reading it. The screened door creaked behind me. I turned and saw my mother standing in the doorway in her robe, watching me. I folded the letter carefully and stood up. My mother stepped onto the porch, her eyes fixed on the paper in my hand. The night air was cool off the water, but I could feel the heat rising in my chest, even though I kept my face calm. "Where did you find that?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but there was an edge underneath it that I had heard many times before. "It was in the storage room," I said. "Grandma wrote it to you a long time ago. I did not know it existed." She reached for the letter, but I did not hand it over right away. "That was between your grandmother and me," she said. "It is old. Things were different then. Susan and I have talked about this for years. Bringing up the past only makes people uncomfortable, especially during a weekend that is supposed to be about your Aunt Linda." I looked at her steadily. "It says you chose to keep me at a distance because other people thought it would make family life easier. It says the rules were never about love." My mother's mouth tightened. She glanced toward the house where the others were sleeping. "Susan, has always been the one who could see these things clearly. She warned me years ago that you took things too personally. She said, if we gave you too much space, you would only ask more questions and upset everyone. I listened to her because she was trying to protect the family from unnecessary conflict. The words landed with the same soft cruelty they always carried. She was not apologizing. She was explaining why the exclusion had been necessary, and she was using Susan's name to make it sound like a group decision instead of her own choice. Before I could answer, the screen door opened again, and Susan stepped out, tying the belt of her robe. She must have heard us. Helen, is everything all right? She asked, her voice full of that familiar, worried warmth. Then she saw the letter. Oh, Emily, I hope you are not letting old papers upset you. Your mother and I have only ever wanted these weekends to feel peaceful for everyone. Sometimes that means making hard choices about who needs space and who does not. I felt the old pattern trying to pull me back into silence. I could have nodded, said I understood, and gone to bed. Instead, I stayed where I was. I am not upset, I said. I am just finally reading what was written down. Susan moved closer and placed a hand on my arm in that gentle way she had. That is exactly what I mean. You are turning a simple letter into something bigger than it needs to be. Your mother has enough on her plate this weekend without you reopening old wounds. Maybe it would be better if we all got some rest and talked in the morning when everyone is fresh. The suggestion sounded reasonable on the surface. It always did. But underneath it was the same request she had made on the phone: smaller presence, less voice, less space. I did not argue. I simply said goodnight and went to my room. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the waves and thinking about how many times Susan had offered concern that had the same result as my mother's distance. They worked together without ever having to say it out loud. The next day, the house filled with more family. My Aunt Linda and Uncle Frank moved through the kitchen making coffee and laughing about old stories. My cousin Rachel arrived with her overnight bag and gave me a quick hug when no one else was looking. You okay? She asked quietly. I found something last night, I told her. An old letter from Grandma. It explains a lot. Rachel's expression changed. She glanced toward the porch where my mother and Susan were already sitting with their coffee. I heard them talking about you again this morning, she said. Susan told your mother that if you stayed for the full dinner tonight, it might change the energy of the whole weekend. Your mother agreed. They decided to seat you at the far end of the table so you would not be in the middle of any conversations. I felt the familiar cold settle in my stomach, but I did not let it show on my face. Thank you for telling me. Rachel looked uncomfortable but determined. I am not going to pretend I did not hear it. Not this time. By late afternoon, everyone had gathered on the screen porch for the dinner. The long table was set with the good dishes my Aunt Linda only used for special occasions. String lights hung along the screens, and the sound of the waves came through the mesh. My Uncle Frank stood at one end with a glass in his hand, ready to make the first toast. My mother sat near the center with Susan on her right. I had been placed exactly where Rachel said I would be, at the far corner with my back to the water. My Aunt Linda raised her glass first. To family, she said simply, and to new chapters. Everyone echoed her. Then my Uncle Frank lifted his glass higher. And to keeping things simple and peaceful, he added, glancing at my mother with a small smile. That is what matters most when we all get together. The words were innocent enough, but they landed like a confirmation of every quiet decision that had ever been made without me. I felt Rachel shift in the chair beside me. She set her glass down harder than necessary, simple and peaceful for who she asked. The porch went quiet because it seems like the rules for peace always end up meaning the same person gets left out of the plans, the conversations, and the photos. My mother's face tightened. Susan leaned forward with that same worried expression. Rachel, sweetheart, this is not the time. Your Aunt Linda deserves a nice evening. Emily understands that sometimes these things are complicated. She has always been sensitive about these weekends. I looked at Susan directly. I understand that you and my mother have spent years deciding how much of me is allowed to be here. I read the letter Grandma wrote. She told you both that the distance was not protecting anyone. It was only teaching me I did not belong. The air on the porch changed. My Uncle Frank set his glass down. My Aunt Linda looked between my mother and Susan with an expression I had never seen on her face before. My cousin Rachel stayed right beside me, her shoulder almost touching mine. My mother tried to laugh, but it came out thin. This is exactly what Susan warned me about: old letters and old feelings turning a celebration into something else. Emily, if you cannot let this go for one evening, perhaps it really would have been better if you had come tomorrow like we suggested. Susan nodded, her voice soft and reasonable. We were only thinking of you. Big groups can bring up so much. We wanted you to enjoy yourself without all the pressure. The words were the same ones they had always used, but this time they did not land the way they used to. I could feel the old need to shrink, to apologize, to make myself smaller so the evening could stay peaceful. I felt it, and I chose not to follow it. I stood up slowly. The chair scraped against the wooden floor. Every eye on the porch turned toward me. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I simply looked at my mother and at Susan sitting beside her. I am not going to shrink to keep everyone comfortable anymore, I said. If that changes the energy of the weekend, then maybe the energy needed to change. I walked off the porch into the dark toward the beach path. Behind me, I heard my Aunt Linda's voice steady and clear for the first time that evening. Helen, sit down. We are going to talk about this letter right now. My cousin Rachel's footsteps followed me a moment later. She caught up with me on the sand. I am coming with you, she said. I am done pretending the rules do not exist either. We walked along the water's edge in silence for a while. The lights from the porch grew smaller behind us. I could still hear voices rising inside the cottage, my mother's and Susan's, and now my Aunt Linda's, all overlapping in a way that had never happened before. The careful, controlled peace they had built for so many years was cracking open on its own. Rachel stopped and looked back at the house. They are going to be at each other for hours, she said. Susan is already trying to say the letter was taken out of context. Your mother is defending every choice she ever made. But Aunt Linda read it out loud. She is not letting them change the words. I nodded. The wind off the water was cold, but I did not feel like going back inside. For the first time in a long time, I did not feel the pull to fix it or to make myself small enough to fit back into the picture they had drawn around me. We stayed on the beach until the voices inside finally quieted. When we walked back up the path, the porch was mostly empty. My Aunt Linda was still sitting at the table with the letter in her hands. She looked up when she saw us. Come inside when you are ready, she said. I told your mother and Susan that the rules end tonight. Either we talk about what Grandma actually wrote, or this family stops pretending we are whole when we are not. I stood on the bottom step of the porch and looked at the woman who had spent decades deciding how much of me was allowed to exist in her version of family. She did not look at me. Susan sat beside her, still wearing the same expression of worried concern, but for the first time, it did not have the power it once did. I turned to my cousin. I think I am going to head back to my apartment tonight, I said. I need some space to figure out what comes next. Rachel nodded. I will drive you if you want, or I can stay here and keep listening. Either way, I am not going to let them rewrite what happened. I looked back at the screened porch one last time. The string lights were still on. The waves kept coming in. The comfortable silence my mother and Susan had worked so hard to protect was gone, and it was not coming back. I felt the loss of it settle in my chest, heavy and real. At the same time, I felt something else, quieter but steadier, the beginning of a space that belonged only to me. I picked up my bag from the bedroom and walked to my car without saying goodbye to anyone else. Rachel stood in the driveway and watched me go. As I pulled out onto the dark road that led away from the cottage, I did not cry. I did not feel the old ache of wanting to be let back in. I only felt the road stretching out in front of me and the letter folded safely in my pocket. For the first time in 31 years, I was choosing the distance myself. I drove the 2 hours back to my apartment with the windows down and the letter on the passenger seat. The night air smelled like salt even after I left the coast behind. When I got home, I did not turn on the lights right away. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark with the letter in my hands and let the full weight of what I had done settle over me. I had walked away from the only version of family I had ever known. I had chosen the distance myself, and the choice felt both terrifying and strangely clean. The next morning, my phone lit up with messages. My Aunt Linda had texted first early before the sun was fully up. I read the whole letter out loud after you left. Your mother tried to say it was taken out of context. Susan kept interrupting with how she was only trying to help. I told them both I was done listening to explanations that sound like concern but function as control. If you want to talk, I am here. No conditions. My cousin Rachel texted a few hours later. They are still at the cottage. Your mother and Susan spent most of the night trying to convince everyone that the letter was just one old woman's opinion and that keeping things simple was still the right approach. Uncle Frank did not say much, but he stopped defending them. I stayed until this morning. I am not going back to pretending the rules do not exist. Call me when you can. I did not answer either message right away. I made coffee and sat at my small kitchen table, the same table where I had eaten alone for years, while telling myself the exclusions were small and understandable. The letter lay open in front of me. My grandmother's handwriting looked steadier than I felt. She had seen it clearly even then. The distance was never protection. It was fear dressed up as care, and the people enforcing it had convinced themselves it was kindness. By afternoon, my mother called. I let it ring twice before I answered. Her voice was different than it had been on the porch the night before. The careful brightness was gone. She sounded tired. Emily, she said, I do not know what you think you accomplished by leaving like that. Susan and I were only trying to keep the weekend from turning into an argument. You turned it into exactly that. I waited a moment before I spoke. I did not turn anything into an argument. I stopped agreeing to be smaller than I am. There is a difference. She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice had the same soft edge it always carried when she wanted to regain control without raising it. Susan thinks you are punishing the whole family for something that happened years ago. She is worried this will affect your relationship with your aunt and uncle. She suggested we give you some time and then try again with clearer boundaries. The suggestion landed exactly the way every previous suggestion from Susan had landed. It sounded like care. It functioned as another attempt to manage how much of me was allowed to exist in their version of family. I am not interested in clearer boundaries that still require me to stay small, I said. I read what Grandma wrote. I am choosing to believe her instead of the story you and Susan built around me. My mother made a small sound, half sigh and half frustration. You are making this much harder than it needs to be. Susan has always been the one who could see these situations clearly. She has been a steady presence in this family for decades. You are choosing to throw that away over one old letter. I felt the old pull to explain myself to soften what I was saying so she would not pull further away. I felt it and I let it pass. I am not throwing anything away, I said. I am finally seeing what was already there. The rules you followed were never about keeping peace. They were about keeping me at a distance so nothing I said or felt could disrupt the picture you wanted everyone to see. I am done living inside that picture. She did not have an answer ready. For the first time in my life, I heard my mother hesitate without immediately offering another layer of concern or explanation. After a long pause, she said, I do not know what you expect from me now. I do not expect anything, I answered. That is the point. I am choosing the distance you spent years creating. I am just choosing it on my own terms. I ended the call before she could respond. My hands were steady when I set the phone down, but my chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with loss. The comfortable silence I had once accepted as normal was gone. In its place was a quieter, sharper clarity. I had lost the version of family that had always required me to be less than I was. I had also lost the exhausting hope that if I just stayed small enough, they would eventually let me all the way in. Over the next week, the messages continued. My mother sent one short text asking if I was still planning to be difficult about this. Susan sent a longer message through my mother's phone, full of the same worried language. She was concerned about how this was affecting everyone. She hoped I would reconsider. For the sake of family harmony, she was available to talk if I needed help processing my feelings. I did not reply to either of them. My Aunt Linda called on the fourth day. She did not ask me to come back or to smooth things over. She simply said, I told your mother and Susan that the letter changes what I am willing to accept. I will not sit through another weekend where one person is managed like a problem while everyone else pretends everything is fine. If you want to come to the cottage again, you will always have a place. If you need space, I understand that too. Either way, I am on your side. Rachel called the same evening. They are still trying to frame this as you being too sensitive, but Aunt Linda is not backing down, and Uncle Frank has stopped trying to smooth it over. Susan keeps saying she was only trying to protect the family from conflict. I finally told her that the conflict only exists because they built it by keeping you out. She did not have an answer for that. I listened to both of them without promising to return or to fight. I thanked them for standing where they stood. I told them I needed time to decide what my relationship with the family would look like now that the old rules were broken. They did not push. They simply let me have the space I had chosen. In the quiet weeks that followed, I went to work, came home, walked along the same streets I had walked for years, and slowly let the shape of my life settle into something new. The loss was real. There would be no more careful invitations that came with hidden limits. There would be no more pretending the exclusions were small or accidental. The family I had known, the one built on invisible rules and managed distance, was no longer available to me. I had walked away from it and it had not followed. At the same time, something else was growing in the space that remained. I stopped checking my phone for messages that would never come on their old terms. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head for why I was allowed to take up room. I started making plans for weekends without waiting to see if I would be included. The self trust I had been reaching for my entire life was no longer something I had to beg for. It was something I could practice every day in the choices I made when no one else was watching. The ironic part, the part that still catches me off guard when I think about it, is that the very peace my mother and Susan had worked so hard to protect by keeping me small was the first thing to disappear once the truth was spoken out loud. They had believed the distance was necessary to hold the family together. Instead, the family they tried to preserve fractured the moment the rules were named. They did not need me to do anything dramatic. They only needed the letter to exist and one person willing to read it without looking away. I still feel the loss on some days. There are moments when I miss the version of family that existed before I knew how much of it had been built around my absence. But I no longer confuse that missing with a reason to go back. The quiet victory is not loud or triumphant. It is simply the steady knowledge that I can live without shrinking. I can choose the distance when the closeness requires me to be less than whole. That choice does not make me cold or ungrateful. It makes me honest. Sometimes letting go is the right choice, even when the people you are letting go of are the ones who are supposed to love you without conditions. The truth does not always arrive with fanfare or justice. Sometimes it arrives in an old letter found in a storage room, and the only power you have is deciding whether to keep living by the rules it exposed or to step outside them. I chose to step outside. The road in front of me is longer and lonelier in some ways than the one I left behind, but it is mine. That is enough. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for staying with me through all of this. If this story found you in a place where you are still trying to shrink to keep a version of family intact, I hope it gives you permission to stop. Drop support if you needed this.